This was one of my first attempts to test the true load-bearing capabilities of what was my first car. I had decided to use beech for my first proper workbench, and it's fair to say that I brought more than my fair share. None of it would go to waste though, as I also had a dining table project in mind. Most of the timber was 3 inches thick, and being up to 7 feet in length, I found it was best to use a 9-inch circular saw, which I purchased second hand especially for this job. It wasn't entirely necessary to plane the sawn edges at this stage, but I wanted to be able to look at the wood underneath. Once all of my components were cut over size, I stacked them indoors for several days, which is not an essential step for a workshop project, but it helped me to reduce the moisture content before I plane them down to finished sizes. All of the wany-edged offcuts were chopped up and given away as firewood, while the sapwood strips were resawn to create wooden bars for my sash cramp heads. I then started by working on the 2 end frames, which would be joined by 4 long rails that were also removable. All of the leg mortises were cut using an inexpensive mortiser. These large tenons were cut using a simple router jig that I'd made, making one pass on the first face before flipping the piece over to create the second shoulder. After that, I used the draw boring technique to pull the joints in tightly with hardwood dowels. I use what's known as a tenon cutter to create these joints, a very clean cutting bit available from Wilden Tool Company in Kent. I also added some shaping to what would become the feet of this workbench. Because these components were quite large, I found it was also easier to create chamfers with the piece held still and holding the router in my hands, as opposed to using a router table. The assembly of each end went together well, and these are the only portions of this framework that gets glued. Once that glue had cured, I could assemble the long rails without glue and drill holes through that would allow me to attach them with coach bolts, washers and nuts. Before planing any material for the top, I gave the frame its first coat of Danish oil and let it to dry in the sun. Preparing material for a 6-foot long workbench top in my workshop was quite a challenge. I did find splitting and cracking to be an issue with this batch of timber, and I've since learned that it can be a common issue with locally grown beech. One alternative may be to use steam beech, which is usually imported from Europe, is inexpensive and has more of a pink hue. My workbench top was to be made of several narrow widths, each about 4 inches wide and 3 inches thick. I could have used biscuits, but decided it might be easier to route full-length grooves and fill them with a spline made from 6mm plywood. I completed this glue up in several stages, which allowed me to flatten each section with my thicknesser. End caps were about 3 inches square, and these would be fitted to both ends of my workbench. Working outdoors in Britain, you need to be prepared for the inevitable rainfall, even in July. I chose to attach the top to the frame with coach screws, and while this works, it was actually quite difficult to access these screws in practice. Not that I need to do this very often. I used my 1/2-inch router once more to flatten the assembled workbench top, with a pair of 4x2s either side and an improvised sled to carry the router back and forth, up and down the length. My new circular saw was useful again to trim the top to its final length. Some people will use coach screws to attach the end caps, but I wanted a more traditional mortise and tenon approach here. Again, I would use the jaw boring technique, allowing for expansion and contraction across the width of the top. Glue is applied only to the centre of the joint. My router was useful once more for flush trimming the end caps, using a technique I learned from one of Jeremy Brune's books on routing. I bought myself a small arsenal of bench vices with the intention of creating a dual tail vice on one end, but I would later remove them both as I found they weren't as effective as I'd hoped and generally got in the way. I wanted a tool well at the rear of this bench, and that would mean joining an additional rail, for which I decided to cut a lap dovetail joint. Once that was attached with glue, I could turn my attention to drilling many dug holes, something which is a feature of a previous video. I also added 1-inch thick feet to the base of each end frame, which would help the load to sit comfortably on an uneven garage floor. To conceal the nuts that would hold the long rails in place, I cut rectangular pockets with my router, just large enough for my socket spanner. The top was also treated to several coats of Danish oil. While this offers some protection to a surface that's going to be abused, I find it's mostly useful for allowing the instant removal of dry glue. A few months down the line, I decided to redesign my tool well to hold a selection of leaded boxes, as it was mostly serving as a trough to hold shavings, sawdust and tools that couldn't be found. In another video, I show you how I modified my bench once more to incorporate this idea down the centre of my workbench. In the video description below, I'll include links to both videos I've mentioned. In the meantime, I thank you for watching, and I hope you'll one day consider building your own workbench, because having something that's tailored to you and your workshop may transform your woodworking.